Welcome back to Chapter 3 of our Chess Beginner's Guide videos. The 4 videos illustrated talks about the following concepts. Number 1. Passed pawns. Number 2. Escort the pawn. Number 3. Sacrificing to promote. And finally, number 4. Pawn breakthrough. Chess consists of 3 sections. These are the opening game, the middle game, and the end game. So far, we discuss about intro to openings, and partly the middle game, which consist of tactics and strategies. This video will introduce you on intro to end games.
One of the quickest ways to end a chess game is to overwhelm your opponent by getting an extra queen. And to get an extra queen, you're going to need to get one of your pawns to the other side of the board. Like this. And in order to do that, you're going to need what is called a passed pawn. A passed pawn is one that has a straight shot to the other side of the board without bumping into another pawn or being able to be captured by another pawn. The pawn has passed all the other pawn obstacles. Look at the pawn on f5. Is this a passed pawn? No, it's blocked by the pawn on f6. What about the pawn on b5? That's right, it's not blocked by any pawns and cannot be captured by another pawn as it advances up the board, so it's a passed pawn. One important feature of passed pawns is whether they are connected or not. Let's see what happens when you have a passed pawn that isn't connected. After b6, black can play king to c6, easily capturing that pawn before it gets to queen. In this position, white can save the pawn on b6 with the move c5. White has 2 connected passed pawns. Black will not be able to capture either of these pawns. Notice if black tries to take the pawn on c5, the other pawn runs up the board and promotes into a queen. Finally, you often can create a passed pawn by trading one of your pawns for one of the opponent's pawns when you have a pawn majority. A pawn majority is when you have more pawns on a certain side of the board than your opponent. In this position, white has 2 pawns against 1 pawn. This is a pawn majority, and white plays b6. After a takes b6, a takes b6, white captures back and now has a passed pawn. Can you make the most of your passed pawns? Let's see. It's a wonderful thing when you have a pawn that can freely run to the other side of the board and queen. But that usually doesn't happen. Your opponent is going to do everything possible to stop your pawn. This is why you will usually have to escort your pawn with your own king. In this position, black uses the king to step in front of the white king to create a virtual shield so that the black pawn can run to the promotion square. After king to f2, white's king cannot move closer to the pawn, so the king tries another path to get to the pawn with king to d3. After g3, there goes the pawn. There's no stopping it after g2. And black promotes. In this next position, looking at the board from white's perspective, white moves the king up the board where it can protect its pawn for the last several moves of its journey. After king to c7, black is absolutely powerless to stop this plan. The pawn is protected by its escort, the king. There's no stopping this pawn. Let's look at one of the most classic endings. White has a pawn on the a-file known as a rook pawn. If black's king can get into the corner on the a8 square, black will prevent white from promoting the pawn, drawing the game. If white doesn't pay attention and just pushes the pawn forward, this is what can happen. Let's take a look. Black's king can no longer be prevented from getting to the corner on a8. White's pawn advances up the board, and black's king keeps getting closer to it. White's pawn is now in serious danger, so white plays king to c6, moving the king closer to its pawn. After king a7, black's king threatens to win the pawn, so white plays king b5, protecting the pawn. After king a8, black's king sits in the corner, so white plays king to b6, forcing black's king out of the corner. After king b8, black will simply move back and forth from b8 to a8 until white pushes the pawn forward with a7. After king a8, if white does not want to move away from its pawn and allow black to capture it, forcing the draw, then after king a6, the game is a stalemate. Black has no legal moves, but the king is not in check. This is why it's so important for white to block the black king from getting into the corner first and then focusing on escorting the pawn. That's why white should play king to c6. After king to d8, black's king gets closer to the corner, but white puts an end to that with king to b7. White's king blocks the king's path to the corner and will now escort the pawn up the board. Black plays king to d7, hoping to get to white's pawn in another direction. And after a4 and king d6, the black king has to spend extra time moving around the white king. a5, king to c5, and after a6, king to b5, black's king makes contact with the pawn, but it's too late after a7. White will promote to a queen on the next turn. Now let's see if you've learned how to escort your pawns. As you know, the object of the game is checkmate. On the way to checkmate, you have to gain a winning advantage, such as queening a pawn before your opponent and using that extra material to win the game. In this position, white is so close to getting a queen, but there is a black pawn in the way. Can you find a sacrifice which opens up a line for white to queen? f6. Excellent. White sacrifices the f6 pawn in order to clear open the path for the g-pawn to promote. If black doesn't take the pawn, white will simply capture black's pawn and promote on the next move. So after g takes f6, white's sacrifice clears the way for the g-pawn to promote. And after g7, white will promote well before black can, and the extra queen for white will win the game. Now let's look at another position. This position looks all locked up with no way to get through. Or is there? That's right. After bishop takes a6, white sacrifices the bishop. If black doesn't take the bishop, white will take the pawn on b7 and push the a pawn up the board to promote. If black captures the bishop with b takes a6, the b file is open for white's pawn to promote to a queen. After b7, thanks to the bishop sacrifice, white will promote to a queen on the next turn. Gaining a queen becomes much more important than losing a bishop. But what about this position? Is there any way for black to break through and to promote the pawn on a3? Yes, with a double sacrifice. After knight takes b3, black sacrifices the knight for a pawn. If white doesn't take the knight, then black will play knight to d4, attacking the pawn on c2, and also the bishop on e6 would threaten the pawn on a2. Not a good situation for white. After c takes b3, black sacrifices a second piece with bishop takes b3. Black is trying to open up the path for the a-pawn to promote. If white doesn't take the bishop, black will simply capture the a-pawn and push the passed pawns up the board to promote. After a takes b3, black plays a2. Black will promote the pawn into a queen and overwhelm white's position. Now let's see if you can sacrifice in order to promote and win. Oftentimes, the best moves in chess come from looking several moves into the future. Moves that look bad at first glance can actually be winning moves. Let's look at a position that seems to be even. Both white and black have 3 pawns, and if white pushes one of those pawns here, then black can just capture, and it looks like a drawn position. But let's look deeper. What is the goal of the endgame? To queen a pawn. If you can do that before your opponent, your queen can usually capture any other pawns and then force checkmate. So would it be worth it then to give away 2 of your 3 pawns if that third pawn could become a queen? Yes, it would. And in this position, you can do just that. The first move seems reasonable, pawn to g6. And if black captures, you can capture back, right? Well, you could, but that isn't the winning move. See if you can find a sacrifice that clears the way for you to promote a pawn. f6. Excellent. The pawn on f6 threatens to capture the black pawn on g7 and will promote into a queen on the next move. After g takes f6, white plays h6. White will promote to a queen in 2 moves and capture black's pawns well before black can promote. What if black tries to get an extra move in the pawn race by ignoring the f6 pawn and capturing white's pawn on h5? Let's see. After g takes h5, white will play f takes g7. Notice black's h-pawn is no match in the promotion race against white's pawn on g7. After h4, g8 equals queen, white promotes first, and black's pawn is nowhere near promoting. After h3, queen g3, white's queen easily catches the h-pawn. After g6, since capturing with the h-pawn loses, does capturing with the f-pawn work any better for black? After f takes g6, if you find the right move, white can promote one of the pawns into a queen. Can you find the winning move? That's right, h6. White uses the same idea. By attacking the pawn on g7, white is able to sacrifice the h-pawn so the f-pawn can run up the board and promote. So after g takes h6, white is able to play f6, and white will win in the same way we just looked at. Now it's your turn to practice sacrificing your pawns to force a promotion.